Hello and welcome to Conversations Lectures. My name is Fatih Krakis and I am the Head of Training for all graduates interpreting and translating based in Melbourne, Australia. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Conversations Lectures is a lecture series that invites translating and interpreting academics, students and practitioners, translating and interpreting technology companies and other researchers and professionals who work in the culturally and linguistically diverse sector to discuss their research and works. Each lecture will be streamed live via the Conversations Interpreting and Translating YouTube channel. So if you are here now, please subscribe so you can get notifications. Today's lecture, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Interpreting in Australia, will be delivered by Dr. Curtis Roman, the Director of the Aboriginal Interpreting Service in the Northern Territory, and Lavinia Heffernan, Project Officer for the Indigenous Interpreting Project at NAATI, the National Standards and Certifying Authority for Translators and Interpreters in Australia. I now invite Dr. Curtis Roman and Lavinia to turn on their cameras so we can see their lovely faces. Hello, welcome. Now, at the end of the lecture, there will be a 10-minute question and answer session, and you can ask your questions via the live comment section, and then I'll be directing them towards our presenters. Now, I would like to do a brief introduction of our presenters. Dr. Curtis Roman, a Larrakia man born and raised on Larrakia country. He is the Senior Director at the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, Northern Territory Department of Chief Minister and Cabinet. Before commencing in this position, Dr. Roman was an academic at Charles Darwin University, where he was employed as a lecturer, senior lecturer, and head of school. He has published papers in academic journals in Australia and overseas on a range of Aboriginal topics. Dr. Roman is the first Aboriginal man to complete a PhD at Charles Darwin University. He is currently an adjunct fellow at Charles Darwin University and continues to supervise PhD students doing research on Aboriginal topics. Welcome, Dr. Curtis Roman. Lavinia Heffernan. Lavinia is a Pintupi Luritja woman from a small community 3 hours northwest of Alice Springs called Pupanya. Pupanya is where she spent her early years speaking Pintupi Luritja and learning and living her culture. Lavinia is a NAATI certified Pintupi Luritja interpreter. She also holds a bachelor's degree in general studies in education from Queensland University of Technology. Lavinia is currently working as a project officer at NAATI on the Indigenous Interpreting Project. The main aim of the project is to get as many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language interpreters certified as possible. I now invite Lavinia, who is joining us from Brisbane, Durbal country, and Jagara Yagara country, Queensland, followed by Dr. Curtis, who is joining us today from Darwin, Larrakia country in the Northern Territory. Over to you now, Lavinia and Dr. Curtis.
Ngai kini Lavinia and ngai lo ngai nyina ni yukumpe and ngai nyina pe yukumpe juda nguranga Brisbane ala South Siding ngai ngai ta kwar nyuranga la urma wangkanyi yakra juda nguranguro and turbo juda nguranguro and ngai lo njurin chana njen tumina jako tumai nguranga chana bangunchi ngai nyina ngai nguranya ra lui pinpi luiki ngura tuta nguranga ngana Pupanyela. You are so ngai kini Lavinia and ngai luna ngai war karibai Indigenous Project Officer ngai ta nganalana nari chutalan. So I just did a acknowledgement. I'd like to thank the people's country that I live on. I actually live in Yukonbeh country in south part of Brisbane, and I am a Pintupi Luritja woman from Pupanya community. And I'm currently sitting in the office of the Yagara Jagara people and Turrbal people, and would like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this particular area. So again, so hello, my name is Lavinia Wipananapaldari Heffernan, and I am one of the Indigenous project officers that works with NAATI.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name's Curtis. I'm sitting in Darwin, which is Larrakia country, the country of my own people. So it's a real pleasure to be sitting in my own country and having this conversation with you today.
Ya piyo kono ka kwan ka walchanga nyuranga laguru ngai lo nawan ka nyipin biluita ngai ko mama kwanka ngai ko mama kwanka. And so yes, like I said, my name is Lavinia and I am talking to you in my mother's language, which is the Pindabilocha. So I am one of the Indigenous project officers that works with NAATI, and I just want to provide you a little bit of contextualization and background about the history of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interpreting service. So multilingualism and interpreting has been part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander society since forever. So in Central Desert, it's very common to speak more than one language. So for myself, even though I grew up speaking Pindabiluritja, I was surrounded by many of the neighboring dialects because we'd travel to a lot of these communities, but also have family in a lot of these communities where we, I guess there was like a level of expectations that you understood the neighboring languages. So it's very common for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and specifically in the Western Desert or Central Australia, to have more than just be able to speak more than just one language. So most people will recognize the AISNT map just over here. You've probably seen it around in offices and things like that. So this map here is a lot of the languages that were traditionally spoken before colonisation. And what a lot of people don't realise is that a lot of the Aboriginal languages to this day are still spoken in Australia, like the traditional languages. And to the right of the map, just on this side here, you can see there's like a dotted dots on the map. Sorry, I'm trying to coordinate the pictures and the dot pointing. So that's where a lot of the traditional languages are still spoken. There's some up further up north here, up in the up to the top end of Australia and across to the Cape parts of Australia and into the Torres Strait. I'd also like to point out that there are new forms of languages that a lot of Aboriginal people are speaking now as the first language, and it's like Creole, and Aboriginal English has also been recognised as well. So there's so a lot of Aboriginal children are now speaking a Creole as a first language, or even so that it's happening more and more in schools. So, and that second map was published last year in the National Indigenous Language Report, showing areas of Australia where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids are acquiring an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language as their first language. These areas then show you where the interpreting industry has been concentrated. The industry, though, operates in major service centres, capital cities like Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, where language speakers often go for health services. So when somebody gets sick back home on country, and now my home country is like round about there, close to the WA border, we would often get sick and would get flown down to places like Adelaide or up to Darwin. And for those who live more towards that have sort of migrated over to Mount Isa from Central Australia or from the pitlands in South Australia and across the border where most of our languages, the Western Desert languages, are located, would be flown to these big cities like Perth and Adelaide. And if you go up into the top end of Australia over here where Bamaga is and the Torres Strait, many will be flown into Brisbane for medical needs. So a little bit of history again of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interpreting. Even just looking at places where language is acquired by children, training opportunities and interpreting services have developed differently in different parts of the country. Behind every development and success, there has been a huge effort, hard work, passion, and years of campaigning by talented Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interpreters, trailblazing services, training organisations, and advocates. Often the battles continue. to convince service providers, politicians, judges, etc., that interpreters should be used, to get sufficient and consistent funding, to convince families to use interpreters, to be able to offer interpreters good employment opportunities that keep them in their profession. This is by no means a full history, but we can point out some of the key organisations that have played and continue to play a big role. The first Aboriginal interpreting and service was set up by the Institute of Aboriginal Development, IAD, in Alice Springs in 1983, with significant early interpreters like the late Kumanjay or Kumaran Yami Lester, and people like Veronica Dobson and Lizzie Ellis. And AUSIL or SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics, at that time were heavily involved in translation and played a role in supporting language studies and bilingual education across the country where First Nation languages were being spoken as first language. Back towards where I'm from, the Lutheran missionaries were very earlier on were writing in the Western Aranda language in Hermannsburg because they felt that there was a need to learn the people's language first. So not to try and assimilate them into speaking English first, they learnt the language of people's language first. So various TAFEs have been involved over the years in earlier days, Bachelor of Institute, and in more recent times, TAFE SA, particularly catering to the APY lands. For those of you who don't know what APY is Arango Pitindara Yankunjara lands. And for a bit of contextualization, that is around where Uluru is, around that area. The establishment of this big service has been the game changer. The AIS, which is the Aboriginal Interpreting Service in the Northern Territory, as part of the Northern Territory government, as Dr. Curtis will be talking to, and KISS, the Kimberley Interpreting Service, which is now Aboriginal Interpreting Western Australia, AOA. So AOA covering all of Western Australia, which is an independent Aboriginal corporation, and it's got some passionate board members. So many other Aboriginal language centres have also been involved over the years in delivering interpreting services, and now more and more there are independent interpreters operating their own business. So people like myself who actually operate and run my own business, have my own ABN, and actually get contacted through the directory of NAATI. So I'm able to be found on there. So outside of Northern Territory and Western Australia, other interpreting services have expanded their scope to provide services in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, such as 2M in Queensland and ABC Multilingua in South Australia. And the South Australian government is currently in the process of setting up stages of creating an Aboriginal interpreting service, which is a branch of the ITC. And I did write down a note. The ITC is an interpreting and translating centre, and it sits with the Human Services in South Australia. So the industry is strengthening with stronger and more policies, protocols that mandate the use of interpreters. For example, the JCCD, Commonwealth Interpreter Protocols, state-based health protocols. The size of the country, the number of languages, and the small number of speakers are some of the factors that make this difficult service to deliver. To talk to this, we have Dr. Curtis Roman, Senior Director of the Aboriginal Interpreting Service, to talk about what the service looks like on the ground. Over to you, brother.
Thank you, Lavinia. I'll talk about the Aboriginal Interpreter Service and the services that we provide in the Northern Territory. So if we go to the next slide. So the Aboriginal Interpreter Service was established 21 years ago. Currently employs about 55 full-time staff and about 141 active casual interpreters. So active interpreters are those who are in our database, are doing jobs for us, and are still in contact with us. So we've got about 141 of those across the Northern Territory. And that includes probably about, 15 perhaps full-time office-based interpreters that are based in offices across the Northern Territory. We have office locations in Darwin, Katherine, Tennant Creek, Alice Springs, Wadair, Warramianga in the Tiwi Islands, Gallawinku and Nhulunbuy. We have different sections in the AIS that are really important to the work that we do. We have a bookings team, and their role is to take bookings for interpreters. So when an interpreting request comes into the AIS, they'll contact the bookings team. The bookings team are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So one of that team always has a mobile number that people can contact in emergencies when they need an interpreter. So that team will, gather information such as what language do you want, are there gender issues that we need to consider, and they'll go about matching the best interpreter for that interpreting assignment. We also have a recordings team, and we have a studio in our offices, and those studios are places where we do our recording work. The recordings work is basically whatever clients want us to record in Aboriginal languages. So they could be things such as COVID-19 messages, for example. We will work with our interpreters to get those messages done. That includes going through a quality check to make sure that they're all done to high standards before we send them back to the client. And the client then determines how they distribute those messages. We just do the messages for them and send them back to the client. We have a training team, and they have two responsibilities, I suppose. One is to ensure that our interpreters are being trained and being developed professionally as interpreters through things such as on-the-job observations, where our interpreters will go with those new interpreters after they've satisfied our induction requirements and observe them and provide them with feedback about how they can do things better, and just monitor their confidence and those sorts of things. Another one of the training things that we do with our interpreters is shadowing, where new interpreters will come in and accompany more experienced interpreters to interpreting assignments to get some tips and observe how they do things in those environments. The other role of our training team is to deliver working with interpreter training sessions to service providers that use our service and that deliver services to Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. And that's really important because, a lot of people often, it'll be their first time working with interpreters, or it'll be their first time working with Aboriginal interpreters. And these sessions cover things like, what do you do when you want to book an interpreter? How much time do we need? How to sit, how to go about interacting with the interpreter and the client. It's really important that we deliver those services, that training to service providers. Another one of our teams is a training liaison team, and their roles are basically to recruit interpreters and to provide support to interpreters. Providing support to interpreters is really important. So you can imagine when, for example, our interpreters are doing end-of-life interpreting, that can go on for days or weeks when they're involved in violent crimes in courts, these sorts of things. It's really important that we are there supporting them and making sure that they're okay. So that's a really important role where we have ongoing contact with our interpreters to make sure, as I said, that they're okay, and providing them with the support that they need before they go off to another job. And then we have an operations team, and these guys are really important. These guys manage our stats and make sure that we have a good understanding of the work that we're doing. And this is really important when it comes to providing reports for funding bodies, that we're able to manage those stats and have a good understanding of the work that we're doing in each of the regions, and moreover. So if we go to the next slide. So these are the services that the AIS provide. So we do rostered telephone services for Services Australia, formerly known as Centrelink, where we will have interpreters sit in the AIS offices, and they will have three-way conversations with Services Australia staff and Aboriginal language speakers. We also work closely with ABC Radio in Darwin to do news broadcasts in Aboriginal languages. So that's a really important project. It's been a long-term project, and it's really unique in the sense that Aboriginal people get to listen to news in mainstream media in their own languages. As I've said, we also do recorded messages in the 18 Aboriginal languages that we service in the Northern Territory. We do interpreter professional development training, working with interpreter training. We do cross-border work in the APY and NPY lands, which is really important to make sure that Aboriginal people in those areas and service providers have access to trained and qualified interpreters, and that we're constantly recruiting and supporting interpreters in those locations. We do interpreting services for meetings, courtroom interpreting, police interpreting. We have rosters in hospitals throughout the Northern Territory. All sorts of interpreting, phone interpreting, audio-visual interpreting. So we do a lot of things in different locations all across the Northern Territory. We go to the next slide. This slide, I suppose, it sort of shows why the Aboriginal Interpreter Service is really important in the Northern Territory. So Aboriginal people comprise just over 30% of the NT population. And because of that, the Northern Territory is a very linguistically diverse region because of the Aboriginal languages. There are many Aboriginal languages and dialects in the NT, including, as Lavinia mentioned, Creoles and Aboriginal English. And it's really important to point out, I suppose, that in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal language speakers will often speak English as a fourth or fifth language, and that can be after their mother's language or their father's language, then a neighbouring community language, and then a Creole, and then Aboriginal English. So it's really important that service providers understand the language barriers that Aboriginal language speakers encounter on a daily basis when using services. We go to the next slide. So these are the languages that we service in the Northern Territory. East Side and West Side Creole. So there are two different Creoles that exist in one town called Catherine. Yolngu Matha. So there are different Yolngu languages in the top end of the Northern Territory. The main one that we service is Jamprapangu. It's a very common language that we service. And there's Walpri, which covers a lot of ground, Catherine, Tennant Creek and Alice Springs. And it's not uncommon at all to have Walpri speakers in Darwin. Pitjantjatjara, Alice Springs, Murrunpatha, top end in the community of Wadair, and Diliaqua. It's a top end language in Gove, the Grid Island area. Eastern Central Aranda, Western Aranda in Alice Springs, Gunwinku, Barada in Maningrida. And in the Tiwi Islands, we have two Tiwi languages that we service depending on the person that needs the interpreter. And these are typically modern Tiwi or traditional Tiwi. So we try to make sure that we have enough interpreters to service both of those needs. And then there's Bintabi Luricha in Alice Springs, Gorinji in Catherine, Mong in the top end, Alyawara in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, Majara in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, and Warramungu in the Tennant Creek area. So they're the most common languages in the NT. They're certainly the languages that we get most of our requests for and that we service on a daily basis all over the NT. And if we go to our next slide, this is a really important question. Why use the Aboriginal Interpreter Service? It's because we provide trained and certified interpreters, and that's really important for service providers and those working with Aboriginal people to sort of understand the importance of that. We're the only government provider of Aboriginal interpreting services in the NT. And importantly, what we do is that we screen interpreters to make sure the most appropriate interpreter is sent to interpreting assignments. Because if you send the wrong interpreter, it can mean that the person using the service can leave the service. It can mean that the interpreter feels uncomfortable, and it means that you've got to go through the process of getting another interpreter. So it's really important that we use our local knowledge in the service and that we get the best interpreter for the situation. And there are lots of things that impact on situations among Aboriginal people in the NT, such as community conflict, gender, kinship systems where people have to avoid each other, gender, as I said. So lots of reasons why it's really important to make sure we're getting the best interpreter for each assignment. But of course, there's a big difference between a trained and certified interpreter as opposed to language speakers. It's not uncommon for people to think, well, I've got staff members, I've got people in the community that we can use because they use that language, they can speak that language. Of course, the first question that we ask is, well, how do you know that? How do you know that the person who is being provided with the interpreter understands that? How do you know that they're both comfortable with that situation? Does the person who needs the interpreter want that person to know their personal affairs? So there is a big difference, around accuracy, impartiality, ethics, confidentiality, particularly in the Aboriginal community and the NT, because of traditional reasons and because the Aboriginal community, because of its kinship system, is sort of a tighter group of people. And therefore, people might not want other people to know their personal affairs. And so if we go on to the next slide, we're a very unique service provider, particularly as a public sector service provider, in that we rely on casual staff to deliver our services, and the people who deliver our services are traditional Aboriginal people, which is fantastic. In saying that, we have to contend with things such as remoteness, which can be challenging when we have to deliver professional development to interpreters, conflict of interest issues, as I said, that can be related to traditional Aboriginal culture, such as kinship and avoidance relationships, gender, and community conflict. And it can also relate to people not being comfortable with certain people knowing what's going on in their lives. So it's really important that we get the right people, as I've said previously. Interpreter pay levels. Our interpreters are the backbone of our service. I think, we are always working towards coming up with ways to making sure that they are paid appropriately, given the important work that they do. It's really important, I suppose, when you have a workforce of 55 Aboriginal people and about 150 casual interpreters, that the leadership style of the service is culturally appropriate. And I think there is a different leadership style among Aboriginal people. I think it's more about leadership and management. I think it's about acknowledging Aboriginal culture, privileging Aboriginal culture, making sure that you're available to work through issues and having a knowledge of those cultural issues so that you can resolve issues together with your staff. That's really important. It also really important there is telling people when they've done a fantastic job, acknowledging that and just being positive and inclusive of Aboriginal ideas and Aboriginal approaches at all times. It's really important, as I said, to be aware of kinship issues, community conflict issues, and making sure that interpreter well-being is front and centre at all times. So if they're involved in, sensitive courtroom interpreting, such as child removal, violent crimes, these sorts of things, it's really important to check in with them and let them know that their well-being is our priority. Kinship and gender, again, it's about knowing those issues and working with our interpreters to find ways to work through those issues, not forcing them to do things, but saying, how do we work through these issues together in order to provide services and meet demand? So it's really important to have a culturally appropriate environment. And I think that means in a leadership role that you are grounded, your door is always open, that you're always accessible to staff, and that you fully acknowledge and show that our Aboriginal interpreters are crucial to our business, and that we cannot provide services without them. One of the other workforce issues that we contend with on a daily basis is that being public servants, we have to abide with a code of conduct. And so we have to really ensure that our interpreters have a good grasp of that, and make sure that they understand the potential penalties associated with breaching those that code of conduct. So a range of issues that we have to work through, and I honestly believe that we do that really, really well on a daily basis. If we can go to our next slide. So these are some of the, some of our past and current projects that we are working on. The ABC radio news broadcast that we work with the ABC radio in Darwin on. That's really, really important, in terms of, not just in terms of things like reconciliation, but in terms of Aboriginal people getting to hear what's going on around them in their own language. And the issue there is that's a mainstream media outlet. So that's really important, and we're really, really glad to be involved in that project. The interpreters hear themselves on the radio, and it's just a really good project to be involved in. We were recently involved in a hospital ward round trial, which was fantastic. It gave our interpreters the opportunity to be at the coalface with Aboriginal patients while those patients were interacting with health professionals. They were there, they were able to interpret. Aboriginal patients were able to ask questions, and our interpreters were just crucial to that communication. We've recently secured some funding from NAATI to hold a interpreter recruitment camp. So to do that, we partnered with the AFLNT, and we identified a language that we've had some challenges historically in terms of recruiting and retaining interpreters. And so for this particular camp, we focused on the Murrunpatha language. We identified camp participants. We brought them into the Michael Long Centre. They stayed there for a week. The Michael Long Centre has all the facilities, accommodation, kitchens, dining areas, teaching rooms, basketball courts, all of those sorts of places with recreational activities. Brought these guys in. They were able to develop bonds with each other, and they were able to develop bonds with AIS staff. And, some of them have shown that they've got the goods to be interpreters, they've got the skills, they've got the language proficiency to be interpreters. And as I said, we've been able to get them to develop a bond where they can support each other when they go back, and that they are now familiar with us and we're familiar with them. And hopefully, the outcome there is that those camp participants are long-term interpreters for the AIS. So last year, we received a Chief Minister's Award for Public Sector Excellence for the work we've done around COVID-19 messages. And that was done in our recordings area. So our recordings area, fantastic staff. They would often stay back late and work on weekends, worked at tight deadlines. There were messages that were constantly changing. around travel restrictions, physical distancing, staying home from work, a whole range of messages, and our interpreters were able to work with our recordings staff, get those messages completed in quick turnaround times and get them completed to high quality. So it was really, really pleasing for us to get that Chief Minister's Award for Public Sector Excellence. One of the other projects that we're working on is we're working with the Menzies School of Health Research in the Northern Territory, and we've secured $60,000 worth of funding to develop Australia's first ever diabetes educational resource in Aboriginal languages. So we're really, really pleased to be working on that. Really looking forward to getting Aboriginal people to understand diabetes in their own languages. As I said, it'll be the first of its kind. So we're really proud to be a part of that. We've recently received a Prime Minister's Eye Award, where we had telephone recordings, telephone messages, recordings in police stations where people could ring the police station in their community and get information in their own language. For the last 3 years, we've had public symposiums. The first one we had, I think it was in 2019, which was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So we teamed up with Charles Darwin University and Batchelor Institute of Indigenous Tertiary Education, and we invited lots of high quality speakers to come and talk about the importance of language and interpreting. That event was attended by about 120 people. The following year, we teamed up with the Menzies School of Health Research to do one that specifically relates to health. Again, that was attended by about 120 people. And by popular demand, we've done one this year, again with Menzies School of Health. High quality speakers at all of these. Again, at this third one, there are about 120 people who attended. And for us, it's a really good opportunity to let all of the people in attendance know why interpreting services are so important for their staff and for the Aboriginal people that they provide services to. We were recently involved in an emergency call centre trial where for the first time people could call the emergency call centre in Darwin and talk to somebody in their own language. So that was a really, really good project, and we are hoping that continues. We recently received some funding from the Public Health Network to develop a health dictionary that we will use to train our interpreters and to prepare them to be able to provide high quality interpreting services in healthcare contexts. And we're also working with the Department of Health up here to develop some messages around sexual health diseases, sexually transmitted infections. They'll be in Aboriginal languages, and we'll get them done as recordings. So that's still in the early days, but we're looking forward to providing Aboriginal people that important health information in their own languages. So we've got a few projects happening. Obviously, we have to always consider when we can take on more projects, given that we have limited capacity, because we've also got to provide interpreting services on a daily basis as well. So if we go to the next slide. So Lavinia is going to take it from here.
Hello again. So as I introduced myself before, I am Lavinia Nabaldari Wipana Heffernan, and I am a Pindapi Luritja woman from Papanya community. And for those of you who don't know where Papanya community is, it is 3 hours west of Alice Springs. So there's Alice Springs just there, and you travel out there. And my language group actually goes all the way to the WA border. So all the way up to a place called Kilrukura. So that's my language area group, and I am NAATI certified. I am NAATI certified in the Pindapi Luritja language. So I spent most of my childhood in Popanya community. As you can see here is a picture of Popanya community and me in front of Popanya community as you enter in. And to the right here, there's a little mountain called that is very significant to Popanya, and it's actually the honey ant dreaming. And if you don't know what a honey ant is, it's very delicious. It's just the picture next to it. So that's our dreaming. We are the honey ant people from that particular area. So I spent most of my childhood living in Popanya community, learned to read and write in my first language, in my mother's language, and would often travel to neighboring languages and be exposed to many languages. My grandmother was a Walpuri Pindabi, and my grandfather's father was a Yankunytjatjara man. My grandfather who raised me was a Pitjantjatjara man, Nganyatjara, and a Pindabi man, and he's here in the picture. So back in the old days, before our name changed to Pindabi Luritja, we were actually known as the Mayatjatjara people. Our name Pindabi Luritja was changed by the Western Aranda people and the Walpuri people. So the original word was Lurinyi, meaning foreigners on country, and so we were brought over to Aranda country in the early days, and then the Walpuris called us Pindabi. I'm not going to tell you what that means. Maybe you need to look at one of the dictionaries, Pindabi Luritja dictionaries, to find out what that word actually means. So Pindabi people were the last language group brought into Western civilization, some of them coming in as late as 1985. And my grandfather, who's pictured here again, was one of the drivers that used to travel out to collect the Pindabi people in the truck alongside Jeremy Long. Oh, I should tell you who the other people are in the picture. So I've got my mum sitting with me, my beautiful mum, Koyada, and I've got my other family that are my dad and my brother and stepmom, my little sister, and my daughter, and my other daughter, and my husband and my son. And over to the right here is my older brother and my younger brother. And that's me pointing home, ready to go home early this year. So I began my interpreting journey at a very young age. I was exposed to many of the Western Desert languages, as Dr. Curtis mentioned earlier, that you don't just learn one language, you learn many languages. So a lot of our Aboriginal language speakers in Central Desert actually know multiple languages. I did a lot of informal interpreting for my family at a very young age. And as I got older, it became second nature to explain things to family, especially when watching movies with my mum, who couldn't tell the difference between a brunette and a blonde-haired lady on TV, or the movie scene having its own storyline to what was actually happening. So yeah, that was very interesting with my mum. So my parents were also involved in teaching Pindabi Luritja in the early years with IAD, the Institute of Aboriginal Development, where they would utilize me as the guinea pig, you could say, to follow instructions in the class and help my parents out. So many of the health workers back in the days would travel to Central Australia to work in some of these remote communities, and some of them would learn language, and Pindabi Luritja was one of those languages that they taught at IID where my parents were involved, and of course myself as the demonstrator. So as you can see, I grew up around languages and became a bit of a language nerd and passionate about getting the right meaning across. By seeing so many of my family members not fully comprehending the message in English to language would at first give me the giggles, especially when I was younger. But when I got older, I began to see how important of a role I played for my family and my extended family. My family saw that from me at a very young age and would often pressure me or be hard on me to make sure that I finished school, which I now reflect to and appreciate as an adult. I started to work. So how did I find out about NAATI and how did I get into this sort of interpreting? So I started to work for Child Protection and realized that I was using my language skills a lot in my role. And I began to think, oh, one day I'm going to be called on the stand to testify my language credibility. I started to search to see what was available to me to show that I had this ability to be multilingual. I came across an ad in the paper where NAATI was looking for Pitjantjatjara interpreters. And that was where my journey began to try and become NAATI certified interpreter. I just want to quickly talk about these photos and who these people are. So I was very, very fortunate where I was brought up in both Western world and cultural world, and the people that played a significant role in my childhood. So my grandfather, Old Gilby Snowy, he played a significant role. He had two wives. The first wife was my grandmother, Itwali, and the second wife was Nana Martha. So Juliata. And she's also in this picture. And next to her is my great-grandmother's sister, Jalpe, and her daughter, Nali. And Nali was one of my teachers as I was growing up as a young girl who taught me how to read and write in my language. And that's another picture of my mum and my sister and my daughter. Back to the middle here. So that's my dad in the picture in early years before he's a bit older now. We would often travel and visit my family in Sydney, and my grandmother would play a significant role in ensuring that I was also exposed to Western world. So we spoke a lot of language at home, a lot of first language in Pindabiluritja. And when we used to visit my grandmother, she used to tell me, oh, you got to learn two ways. You got to learn to live two ways and make sure that you're educated in two ways, not just the one. And of course, around my dad is my dad's siblings, my uncles and two aunties, and recently just found out that I have another uncle. Down below here, that's actually a picture of me doing Inma, doing the Kunga Gutara Chukurpa Inma. So that's one of my dreaming is because I'm Nabildari with the two sister dreaming. And the lady who played a significant role in showing me that was this old lady here in Kaima, absolute gem and absolute awesome person who knew her stuff and would often encourage me to get up and do my dance and dance with her because we shared the same skin name. Funnily enough, a few years later, I ended up marrying her grandson. So just over here is a dictionary. It's the Learner's Guide to Pindabiluritja, which is what my parents wrote together. And I was heavily involved and was around a lot when my parents wrote that dictionary, and I would quite often hear their conversation around, oh, what's this word? Is it this word, or does it go in here, or does it go in there? So yeah, so that was interesting time growing up. Just want to say that my mum, my dad was a English-speaking person, and he learned how to speak. He learned how to speak Pindabiluritja, Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara, and West Narrandera. And my mum was also very talented in speaking many of the languages. So she would speak Western Narrandera, Pitjantjatjara, Ngandjara, Yankunytjatjara, and Pindabiluritja, but would refuse to speak English as well. So, so we were always around language or different languages and exposed to many different languages. So I guess the journey that I took to become a trained interpreter was I went to AIS, so to the Aboriginal Interpreting Service. And that's when I started my very first training as an interpreter. And I didn't realize that there were so many things involved to become an interpreter around the ethical standards and impartiality, boundary playing, and and how that impacts on me as an interpreter on the ground, interpreting for families and some of the cultural obligations that I have. So yeah, so people don't, like I said before, people don't realize how important it is to have the presence of interpreters where meaning can be misinterpreted. For example, so when a doctor is talking to a patient and asking them to take the medicine, what does that mean for the patient? Take has many meanings in English, and it can be easily misinterpreted. So I was doing a job where I heard this being done, where they had interpreted the word take the medicine as physically take the medicine was what was interpreted, mirikina kati, when it should have been mirikina ngalkola or mirikina kultura or mirikina chikela. So which then interpreted into, only eat, swallow or drink the medication. So the word take. So that training at AIS that I did in my early days was really important, and it sort of switched my mind onto another world, where I became more and more eager and more enthusiastic to know more. Another funny thing around what Dr. Curtis mentioned earlier was around the cultural differences as well, the bridge. And sometimes we have to educate the professional about some of the differences. And another job that I did was with a doctor who wanted to amputate 50% of the leg. Now, in Western society, 50% is what? Half. So we know that half, exactly half. So for us, that half means completely different. So if my family was to say, Anya is also my other Aboriginal name, by the way. Anya, apa you, like that means Anya, give me half. Well, that didn't actually mean exactly half. It actually meant like a third. So you can imagine when the doctor is doing some job on a patient and they want to cut half of the leg, and then the patient wakes up and it's more than a half. The horror on the patient's face, you know, of the outcome of half the leg's actually gone. The Western term half. So and another thing that's also coming up and becoming more and more common is Aboriginal English and recognizing Aboriginal English. And earlier on, I showed you a map of all the different traditional languages, but now there's more and more recognition for Aboriginal languages across Australia. And Aboriginal English is the name given to a dialect of English spoken by most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Commonly mistaken as dumb English by many educators and non-Indigenous society don't realise the form of language. It is actually a form of language. For example, a class has a picture of an echidna. The teacher asks the class, "What animal is this?" The Aboriginal child puts her hand up and says, "It's a porcupine." Teacher says, "No, you are not. That's not right. This is an echidna." Now, in one society, this is right. In another society, might not be right. So it's important to recognise that all Aboriginal languages across Australia, whether it's Creole or Pindabi literature, is evolving as well. So, and you need to be aware of the cultural differences. So culture and language together. We don't have measurements where we are. So earlier I spoke about 50%. And some of the legal systems that they have in central Australia. I'm talking Central Australia because that's where I'm from. You know, traditionally we had payback. We didn't have the legal system that we have right now. Mental health is becoming more and more spoken now, but before we didn't talk about our feelings. And I guess some of the other things would be around our relationships, around the importance of knowing that when we go out on these jobs, that they need to be aware that we have cultural obligations to play, and that sometimes we can't actually be in the same room as what we call dampari. So we need to be either talking to a third person, or we need to adjust ourselves to be able to cater to this interpreting to this family. So because of that dampari, it's a poison relationship. We can't have that conversation face to face. Another thing is also, don't think just because you might be my color or darker or lighter, it doesn't matter, that the person doesn't know language, which was something that I used to also come across quite often by families. And one day I was sitting outside and I overheard some Pidginjara people saying, we want to ask Biranban, and I was thinking, Biranban, who are they calling Biranban? I was turning around, looking around, and I was the only person sitting there. And then, of course, I turned around and said, "Hey, we are going to," and they got this the bit of a shock that I actually understood what they were saying. So yeah, so this is why I am where I am today. Because of the people that played a role in my journey. And I just want to point out the people that are sitting in these photos. I'll point out to my brother first. This is Lance McDonald, who works at the Aboriginal Interpreting Service. I call him the man of many languages. And Lance has been my mentor and has been somebody who has, I call when I need support, or if I'm looking for a word, or if he's looking for a word. So we'll collaborate or do a lot of professional solidarity together. I call Lance a man of many languages because he can speak the languages all the way up in the top end of Australia, down to the central parts of Australia, going cross-border to South Australia, Western Australia. So he's very, very talented. And next to him is one of the original interpreters as well, alongside my brother, is my sister Jezebel, cousin sister, not direct family, but she also is a Western Aranda interpreter. And to the top, we did some workshops earlier this year, and we had some Warlpiri interpreters, and I was in the presence of 3 powerful Warlpiri women, and they were all my aunties, of course. So I was making a lot of cup of teas for these 3 lovely ladies. So we have Ani Teresa and Ani Pidgey in the middle, and Ani Bessie on the end there. So that was a challenging time, being in presence of 3 strong Warlpiri women. NAATI business. So you probably already know about NAATI. We are the national standards and certifying body for translators and interpreters in Australia. The NAATI model and standards for testing apply equally to all languages, international, signed, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. So currently, our main work is running CPI testing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. So we are testing, so NAATI, oops, I pressed the wrong button. So NAATI does have testing 170 languages, and around about 40 of them are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. And I guess this is a bit of a map of all the Aboriginal languages that we work with nationally. And currently 161 are certified practitioners. I'll just double check my note, make sure I've got the right number. Pretty sure it's 161. Yes, 161 practitioners across Australia from the 39 languages. So most of these interpreters work through the big services up in, with the AIS and the AWA in WA, Multilingua in South Australia. So there are services out there and that they work through. Or then there's people like myself who is listed in the NAATI directory. So if you're looking for an Aboriginal interpreter and you can't see them in the NAATI directory, highly recommend that you search up AWA, which is the Aboriginal Interpreting Service in Western Australia, or the Aboriginal Interpreting Service in Northern Territory, and Multilingua in South Australia. And I think they're starting up, I know they are starting up a South Australian interpreting service down there as well. So this map here represents the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages and their locations, and the number of people who are certified in Australia. So if we go over here, so the Warlpiri, our competition back home, has the higher number of interpreters than my language group, which is sitting right below where the red dot is. So there are 7 of us in the Pindabee Luritja that are certified interpreters in that language group. And I guess I bit like the map before, I sort of cut down and showing all the different range of Indigenous languages with certified practitioners listed here. So you've got in the Northern Territory, you've got all these names here, and you can see that they go over to Western Australia and South Australia, some of these languages, and over to Queensland even. And it's because of that's, and they only go over border because of, Western ways of border of South Australia and Queensland, so forth. Traditionally, this sort of interaction happened without thinking about any borders, and we had landmarks to tell us where we could go and where we couldn't go, and where tradings happened. So in the Northern Territory, you've got Yankunytjatjara, you've got Pitjantjatjara, but then they go over to South Australia. You've got Pitjantjatjara speakers, you've got Yankunytjatjara speakers there, Ngantjatjara speakers. Same with over here, you've got Pindabee Luritja speakers in Western Australia, Pitjantjatjara speakers. So they're all sort of cross-border, and even over to Queensland, more and more people are travelling, people that are Yawara and Eastern Aranda are travelling over to Queensland, over to Mount Isa and starting a life down there. So here is a list of all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages that have been certified NAATI practitioners spoken across Australia. So NAATI's NAATI Indigenous Interpreting Project. So since the interpreting industry for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages emerged, NAATI has acknowledged this work by accrediting, well, now certifying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language interpreters. Whilst the need always exists, heightened awareness of the need and better language policies are resulting in an increase and demand for certified interpreters. Whilst in the past, NAATI accreditations were generally awarded based on practitioners completing accredited courses or supplying languages services to run testing. Since 2012, NAATI partnered with Australian Government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations to make certification testing a part of our operations and therefore more widely available in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. The main objective of this work is to increase the number of certified Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language interpreters and the number of languages that have been certified practitioners. In 2016, NAATI set up a National Indigenous Language Interpreting Advisory Committee, NILIAC, to provide NAATI with guidance from the industry regarding certification and facilitate communication. This includes representatives from services, education, clients, and practitioners. So the theory of change. So looking mainly at the issue of supply and demand. So we know it's sometimes hard to find appropriately skilled, qualified, certified interpreters. And sometimes some of these certified interpreters have many roles and are on demand all the time, so they won't always be available. Or sometimes services won't engage with an interpreter thinking that everything's going to be all right. And sometimes it's really important to practitioners to realize that maybe they are the ones who need the interpreters present in the room so that they understand what's being communicated. So we try to increase supply to have more NAATI certified interpreters from more language groups. And then we try and increase the demand, increase awareness of the need for highly skilled Indigenous language interpreters. So we try to increase supply for certified interpreters. So more people can access high quality interpreting services when required. And this also means that service delivery is more efficient and effective, better health, justice and other outcomes, equality and social cohesion, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights are upheld. Some of the things that we do as the NAATI staff, there's three of us, there's Lauren, Hannah and myself, is that we deliver most of our things since COVID-19 has sort of hit for many of us are online, but also in person. Bespoke support depending on person's situation, access to training and infrastructure depends on where they live, what support exists in state already, current situation. So we work at an individual level to find out where people are at and what they need and what support we can offer. So we're very flexible and we try and cater to the certified people's needs so people can become certified interpreters. So testing schedules. So under the new certification system, we have tested in 13 languages across South Australia, Queensland, Northern Territory and Western Australia. This year we have run Kimberley Creole testing in Kununurra, Western Australia, and Warlpiri and Central Aranda testing in Alice Springs. And next month, we'll be travelling up to Catherine, if COVID lets us, to do testing in Creole. Wait and watch this space. So that'll make it 14 languages. But also, towards the end of the year, we are also looking at running tests for second time for some of the languages. So we'll be travelling back and doing Pitjantjatjara and Madjara and Western Aranda. Just very quickly, these beautiful ladies are Leora speakers, and they are in Central Australia. Approximately 1,500 speakers are left, so that's the Leora language. Many Leora speakers live in the northeastern parts of Central Australia, approximately 300 kilometres northeast of Alice Springs. So if you've been to places like Tennant Creek, that's where you'll find most of the Leora speakers, or Harts Range, and even across the border to Mount Isa, some people travel. So there is a high demand for Leora interpreters in both the hospital and court system, particularly in Tennant Creek, where many of the speakers live. I just want to point out that this lady here, Wendy Peterson, has been an interpreter for a very long time, and she saw the need that they need more Leora speakers, and she went on her way to collect the two ladies that are sitting next to her, Bonita and Janella, to help her with some of the Leora speaking and practicing and interpreting. So one of the things that she told us at the last CPI workshop that we had with them was, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm getting old, you see. That's why I got Janella and Bonita to help me. I take Bonita and Janella with me to see what I'm doing out in the communities. They watch me when I'm doing interpreting, and sometimes we have a talk at night. They're getting strong speaking English in the Leora. So that's the job we're doing in Tennant Creek. Little town, but a lot of people from the communities. Wendy Peterson, Leora interpreter. It's important to note that Aboriginal interpreting services support these ladies, but alongside NAATI. So we work with them and work with these interpreters in these workshops. Training and mentoring occurs all the time, and it's very strong with these three ladies in Tennant Creek. Some of the other things that we do online, which is a completely new thing for many of us since COVID, I guess, hit. It's no different with our mob back at home, which, you know, sometimes we don't have reception in some of these communities. So it's really good to see that a lot of these mob can jump on and be involved. So we utilised NAATI certified interpreter to help co-deliver NAATI screening requirements. And this lovely lady here from Bamaga is Leonora, and she helped co-deliver, and she's also the chairperson at the NILIAC board. So very, very lucky to have her. Anyway, the people that jumped on did their screening requirements in the intercultural and ethical standard training, and this was all across Australia. So if you look at the one over here on the top corner is in Perth at the AWA office, and then the next one is at the Royal Darwin Hospital, and across from that is the Kununurra office in WA, and down again is my niece from Pupanya. So more people at Pupanya. She was sitting online out there and doing her training online. And I've got people from Catherine who are also online, help doing some training. We had people from Broome, we had people from Alice Springs, Melbourne office, who's one of our, this is Hannah, who's one of our workers, who was based in Melbourne, and of course myself, who was based in Alice Springs. So we had 17 people delivering the NAATI EC/IC online training, screening. These guys here are employed by the as Aboriginal liaison officers at the Alice Springs Hospital, and part of their role is interpreting in the hospital. And they're recruited from the main language groups around Central Australia. So you've got Eastern Central Aranda, you've got Madgira, you've got Western Aranda and Pitjantjatjara. And a lot of these guys here can speak more than one language as well. So this guy can speak Loi Pindapi. I've heard this one speak Pitjantjatjara. So yeah, so they all can change dialects, and Warlpiri for the gentleman in the middle. So they have they're recruited from the main language groups around Central Australia, and they have been connecting to NAATI to progress through the pathway to become certified. And a couple are already certified with a few or more to go. So whilst initially a bit new and out of their comfort zone, they jumped online to do their screening and CPI preparation before we have, before we headed out there to do face-to-face testing. Just a couple of fun facts before we close off. Pupanya community, also known as Warumpi, is where the first art movement came out, and where a lot of the art movement, was first seen, and before it was told on stories. And then one of the teachers saw some talent and got the school that I went to, the school door painted with some house paint. And then from there, it's been a booming industry. Another fun fact, the first Aboriginal singing group was not Youth the Yindi, it was actually Warumpi Band, and Warumpi is Pupanya. So we were the first language singing rock band in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lavinia and Curtis, for your presentation today. That was an amazing presentation, and we have learnt a lot about Aboriginal interpreting services. We will now be taking questions. I have made note of some of the questions here during the presentation, so I can ask Lavinia and Dr. Curtis as well, if you don't mind putting your cameras on again, Lavinia and Curtis, and maybe we can also stop sharing the presentation. Thank you. All right, so first of all, let me read some comments. This is great. Your story, interpreted services story, and the connection between Indigenous peoples and their languages across Australia, clear, clever, and inspiring. So thank you very much. So inspired what you do for Indigenous society. Well done. That was from Tiffany Smith, and the previous comment was from Samantha Disbray. Now, I do have a few questions that I have been taking note of throughout the presentation. So please feel free to take the question. And first question is from Joanna. Has your language changed much from before colonisation until today, or has it remained the same? Apologies for the stupid questions. Thanks.
Absolutely not a stupid question. Just like many of the other languages around the world, we have evolved. So traditionally, Punjabi was a very strong, almost like a Pitjantjatjara twang to it. And as time came in and as time evolved, languages evolved with it. And it's been happening maybe a lot longer than Western contact, because we would, when somebody passes away, culturally, you'd use a neighbouring tribe's word to replace that word. So, for example, if I was to pass away and you couldn't say Anya anymore, which is my other Aboriginal name, they would then borrow neighbouring tribe's language, or I'll call that child by their skin name. So things have changed. Like even for the word Mara, might be Raka, so they'll borrow words from another area.
And
so, yes.
it's inevitable. Language changes, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Lavinia. Another one from Joanna. Are you seeing younger Indigenous generations wanting or eager to learn the Indigenous language or languages of their people?
Can we answer this again? Sorry. So yes, it's more notable, especially here in eastern states, that people are wanting to learn language again. And I believe that the schools in Queensland are starting to recognise that as well, and trying to bring languages back.
Thank you.
Revival.
This one's from Jay. Curtis, this one's for you. Do you have a studio for filming specific Indigenous talent? You were talking about a studio in your presentation.
The studios we have in our AIS offices are for recorded verbal messages only.
Recording?
Recorded verbal messages only.
Verbal messages only. Okay, thank you very much. Now, I know that you've answered this, both of you touched on this matter, but we have had people go in and out of the presentation. And I wonder, Lavinia, if you'd like to explain this one again. What is Aboriginal English? And I think Curtis referred to it as Creole as well. Can you explain that a little bit more?
I guess it's becoming more and more commonly used where, depending on where you grow up and where you're from, it's like a... let me try and use the sophisticated English word, a form of English lexia. So a lot of, depending on your impact on contact in the early years, people speak a form of what seems like it's English, but there are some variations in the language. So, and it's like Creole or Yumpla talk, but we're recognizing it as Aboriginal English. Well, I'm recognizing it as Aboriginal English.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, this one's from Jay Borthwick as well. Can you provide translation services? Curtis, perhaps this one's for you.
Yeah, sure. Look, we don't provide written translation services in the AIS at all. We only provide interpreting services and recorded messages. I think the main thing there is that Aboriginal societies have always been oral societies. And a lot of people today, this varies from place to place, but a lot of people today don't learn to read the languages when they're in written form. So we don't do that, but there are other service providers in the Northern Territory, non-government service providers that do translation services.
And these studios we're talking about are actually used for these audio messages that you were talking about.
Yeah, they're recorded messages, and it's also where we do the ABC News here. So we'll do the recordings of the news stories here and send them to the ABC here, and that's what we use the studios for. There's no video equipment in there at all.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add something
please.
there? So I actually do translation work with my dad sometimes. So we do like a collaboration, and there is orthography in the Pindabilla languages, and it's very similar to the Pidindala, Yankundala, and Nganyatala language group in the Western Desert.
Thank you. Is it difficult to find people to become interpreters? Is another question by Joanna. How's it going out there with the numbers?
We're always looking for more interpreters, always trying to get as many interpreters as we can for all of the different languages, trying to make sure that we have an even mix of gender. So we're always trying to find interpreters, and part of the reason why we're always trying to find interpreters is because interpreters have ongoing cultural obligations that are always going to be their top priority. They've got avoidance relationship, kinship rules that they have to adhere to. So we're always trying to find interpreters. There are some languages where we have more interpreters than others. So definitely there are challenges in terms of getting interpreters in some locations, but we have enough interpreters to ensure that we're providing a good service, a strong service.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for today's lecture. Our next lecture, the dehumanization and rehumanization of the translation and interpreting professions, will be presented by Associate Professor Mark Orlando, who is the Director of the Translation and Interpreting Program at Macquarie University. That lecture will be on the 26th of August, 2021 at 3 p.m. So please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and also hit that little bell for notifications so you are notified when we are live on air or when there are new webinars or podcasts uploaded or streamed live on our YouTube channel. Thank you again so very much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank NAATI very much as well for helping us organize with these lovely presenters today. And again, thank you to Dr. Curtis Roman and Lavinia Heffernan as well. Take care, stay safe, and all the best wherever you may be around the globe. Thank you.